A month or so ago, I played Evolution: The Beginning, which is the family/children version of a game called Evolution that I've heard about and I never played. After playing Evolution: The Beginning, I became curious about the full game, and so I wanted to try Evolution, which in the meanwhile also had expanded from its original configuration, and now there are pretty much two versions of Evolution. One is Evolution, the base game, and one is Evolution Climate, which is not exactly a standalone expansion, it's a standalone game, which also includes the original Evolution. Basically, the difference between Climate and the original Evolution is there is an extra board that allows you to add the effect of climate on the population of the animals that you are controlling throughout the game. Which pretty much means that if you buy Evolution Climate, you can play the full game of Evolution with the climate element in it, and then you can remove all the climate elements and then it becomes original Evolution. I also believe that if you bought the original Evolution, then you can buy climate as an expansion, pretty much, an expansion that bridges between the two. But if you are purchasing Evolution Climate, which is what I'm reviewing in this video, then you pretty much already have both games. You have the game with the climate, and if you decide that the climate part is not too interesting for you, or you want to just change things around and play both versions, then you simply can put that aside and play normal Evolution. In Evolution Climate, players control groups of animals, various species of animals that adapt to their environment over time, gain new trait, grow in size and population, constantly adapt to the changing environment around them, eat each other and figure out better ways of eating each other and or better ways of dodging becoming somebody else's lunch. Let me show how the game works. Here you have the climate board that will go in the middle of the table. It is divided in bands up there that represent different types of climate. You have a pawn that will move back and forth in this direction as the climate gets colder, in that direction if and when it gets hotter. Then you have two decks of event cards. These event cards are associated, one with cold climate and one with warm climate. You shuffled each deck. You draw a card randomly and then you place it in the band that corresponds to that event. Well, to the climate that triggers that event. And when the pawn moves in that area, then that event is triggered, then a new one is drawn. Also, here there are other pieces of information that represent how animals will suffer and lose population if the weather becomes particularly cold or particularly hot, or also how the change in climate affects availability of food. Food is represented by these tokens here, and eating a lot of food is the point of the game. This is the primary way in which you score points. Each food token that your animals eat during the game is a victory point at the end of the game. There are also a couple of other ways of scoring points. This, in the central area of the board, you will place the food tokens that become available, and this is where the animals that eat vegetables mainly will get their food. Other important elements in the game, the super cute first player token, and then trait cards. These are cards that you will attach to your species. Species are represented by small boards that have varying values in population. The higher, well, the more this pawn, this token moves to the right, the higher the population in that species, and body size. The more it moves to the right, the larger the animal in that species. So you have the board representing the general idea of your species, and then you will attach these cards to indicate how those animals adapt to their environment and learn intelligence, by willing to burrow, they become nocturnal, they develop horns, nocturnal again. They become migratory, they may learn how to eat other animals. The red cards apply to carnivore animals. They may become migratory, develop a long neck. There is a large number of possible effects. And some effects are not always good. They are situational. Heavy fur can be really cool if the weather is cold, because it prevents population loss due to cold, but of course then you have a problem if the weather turns hot. Other important elements. These symbols here, some of these cards have the snowflake symbol, and some of the cards have a sun symbol or multiple suns or snowflakes, and then numbers here in that leaf represent adjustments in the number of available food, the amount of available food. Each player will have a hand of cards. Each player starts with a single species with population 1 and body size 1. At the beginning of a turn, each player will select a card from their hand and will place it face down in the middle of the climate, so there will be a bunch of cards there, and for the time being they just stay there. Then players alternate taking turns and spending their cards. Actually, this doesn't have to be done alternately. Players can play their cards and pretty much organize their situation simultaneously. It is in a later phase on animals feed that needs to be done sequentially. So it is possible that everybody will simply play cards at the same time. When you play cards during your main turn, you can use each card for one of several things. You can simply discard it, ignoring anything that is written on it, to increase your body size or your population by 1. You can discard a card to get a new species, so you simply get a new board with the little cubes that go with it. And super important, you may play your trait cards as traits, that is, simply attaching them to your species. Each species can have up to 4 traits attached to it, and that you cannot repeat them. You cannot repeat the same trait twice. And that's how it works. You simply place them by your species, and that means that now that species is able to do the things that are represented on those cards. Some of those traits help the species feed, some specialize them, for example, teach them how to eat other animals. By default, all species in the game are vegetarian, I guess, or plantivores. So you can add traits that will affect the way they feed, what they can eat, and how they can escape being eaten. Once this is done, players enter the phase in which they see what's happening in the environment. That is when you reveal these cards and you look at 2 things. So these symbols here, suns and snowflakes, and at the numbers. Suns and snowflakes. If there are more suns than snowflakes, the climate gets a little warmer, so you move that pawn in that direction by 1. If there are more snowflakes than suns, then it moves towards cold. As simple as that. However, as we said, if it gets particularly cold or particularly hot, then animals, let's say, players start losing population. Those symbols that you see up there indicate that the size of the species that will suffer. So if the weather gets a little bit cold, smaller animals, that is a species that have a body size of 1 or 2, will lose 1 population. The number is the size that gets affected. The number of snowflakes is the damage that they suffer. If it gets really cold, then bigger animals are better equipped, whereas animals with body size of 1 or 4 will lose 2 population. And then when it gets to the Ice Age, everybody loses 4 population. Also, you see a number there that affects the number of food that is available. On the other side of the board, on the hot weather, we have food availability that increases for a while as the weather turns hotter, but only for a while, because when it gets really hot or scorching, that is not good for the food and is not good for the animals either. This time when the weather gets hot, it is bigger animals that suffer. Again, the range indicated there is the type of animal that suffers the damage, and in this case the number of sun symbols is the number of population points, population levels, call them whatever you like, that are lost. So you adjust the climate. If the pawn moves to an area that has a card, you also resolve the effect by simply looking at the symbols that are here or resolving the effect that is described in the text. Then we had cards here, right? We do not only use them to check the change in the climate, but we also use them to produce food. That indicates the number of food tokens that are going to be added to the middle of the board. In this case, we have 6 plus 0 is still 6, minus 1 is 5. And suppose we have an adjustment here due to minus 2. So that tells us that there are only 3 units of food available. It is also possible, by the way, that there is still food there from the previous round. At this point, animals need to be fed, so all players will take turns feeding their animals, doing like a feeding action. Animals that eat plants, quite simply, you go and grab a plant token from the middle of the table, from the area, from the middle of the climate board. They also may have other game effects that allow you to get food from other sources, to get food before other people do, and so on and so forth. You may store food if you have fat tissue. So there are all sorts of game effects that will create variations on the theme. If you have a long neck, then you get first pick, because before the 4 cards are revealed, you take a plant food from the food bank. So the default source of food is the center of the climate board, but the traits that you have may give you the ability of getting food from other places. If there is a scavenger animal, then the scavenger animal gets food when a carnivore feeds, that sort of thing. So being an herbivore is easy because you just get stuff from there. Being a carnivore can be very, very rewarding, but can also be tricky, because in order to be able to feed, you have to attack other animals, and to successfully attack them and gain and turn them into snacks for you, you need to be able to match all of their defensive traits, and your body size needs to be bigger than theirs. So, for example, if I have here a carnivore of 3 that is attacking a species that has a body size of 2, usually would be good. However, here's the tricky thing. Here I have an interesting defensive trait, which is defensive herding. A carnivore must be larger in population to attack this species. Darn, these guys have learned the trick of strength in number. So now for this animal to eat them, I will need to do so. Unless I have other things that allow me to prevent that. In any case, in general, this is the idea. The default for carnivores is you need to be bigger than them, and you need to match their abilities. And sometimes these sneaky herbivores come up with combos of abilities that are really super tricky. The game continues like this, with phases where you will get new cards, place a card there, play cards to change your pool of species, resolve the cards in the middle of the table, feed your animals, and when you cannot feed a species up to its full capacity, up to its full population, and it loses population. If it goes down to 0 population because it was eaten or because it starved, then it's removed. You continue like this until the deck is depleted. Don't be scared, the deck is super thick, but if you're playing with fewer than 6 people, then you do not use all the cards. Continue like this until the deck is depleted. At the point the game is over, and you count victory points. Each time that you ate a unit of food, you put it in your little personal baggie. Very nice looking personal baggies. At the end of the game, you empty your bags, because each food that your species ate during the game is worth a victory point. Each population that you have is worth a victory point. Each trait that you still have at the end of the game is worth a victory point. And at the point, the player with the highest total is the winner of the game. The game is very thematic, and I like that. I like thematic games, although most of the thematic games that I play are about the history, usually military history, or sometimes fantasy history, but I still like the fact that even if the theme doesn't exist, the game has this mimetic quality or pseudo-mimetic quality. It seems to portray something. In this case, it is pretty interesting that the game is portraying these natural biological mechanisms over very long spans of time, and they seem to do so in a pretty realistic, accurate way. I'm not an expert, but from what I know, from what I read, from what I remember from school, this seems to be the way it works. So that if a predator starts getting faster, other animals either get faster than that animal, or with better reaction times, or their population is going to start decreasing, or they figure out other ways like climbing on trees or staying hidden during the day and coming out at night, etc., etc. And all of a sudden, the fast predator doesn't find anybody around until the fast predator starts going out at night too. So the idea that there is this arm race in developing new traits, and sometimes also dropping traits that are not useless to you anymore, so that you can match the competition that matches, comports with what I know about the theme. And I know that the game has received praise from the scientific community, so it seems to work well in that department. But also, what is most important to me, it works well as a game. To me, the fact that it's also realistic is a nice added bonus, but I played plenty of abstract games or Euro games that do not have much of a theme, and the important thing is, do the mechanics work with one another? In this case, they really do. There really is this organic sense of everything influencing everything else. Not a single trait is good per se under all circumstances. I'll add a footnote to that. There are some things that are, whoa, it's absolutely great. I have this trait and this trait and this trait. I can't see these going bad, not being great. But for the fact that you have limited resources, so if you developed all of those traits that are awesome to have, maybe you haven't built your size enough and then you get eaten more easily, or maybe you haven't built a lot of population, then sudden changes in the environment may damage you. You do not score nearly as many points at the end of the game if you have a small population. So there are some traits that seem to be always good if you have them, but then the very fact is that if you have them, you may not have invested in something else. So even though the description of some effects is like, whoa, this is objectively very good, there are times in which it may be better not to get the trait and to use that card to burn it as a resource to do something else, to diversify, to start new species, growing population, growing body size, etc., etc., etc. And again, I really like the fact that everything is so relative to what other people are doing, to what other animals are out there, competing for the same resources, competing for you as a resource as you're trying to run away, and also interacting with the environment. The climate expansion really is nice. And I like the fact that its use is very flexible. That is, I can see how in different groups it will work very differently. When we played the game, we tended to see the climate part of the game almost as a cooperative game. We liked the fact that we had temperate climate and we were trying to adjust and stay within that Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. If it just so happened we were putting foot down, we went too much in one direction, then even without having to agree to it, we tended then to try to balance things in the other direction. Does that mean that the expansion, the climate element was useless to us? Why have it if in any case we're trying to create the same situation that you had when you don't have the climate situation, that is the game, the climate has no effect? Well, having the climate element and having to work to keep the climate stable, to me was much more interesting than having the climate stable, irrelevant, trivial, neutral to start with. I like the fact that the default position is not the climate is reliable. It can change, and yes, if some people make mistakes even when they're trying to play cooperatively, or if you're just there and you're like, okay, I don't want things to go too cold, but given the cards that I have, maybe I'll go cold this time, and I hope that the people balance it differently. The fact that the game may change affects the strategy and the interaction and the alchemy of a group, even if there are no large swings of climate within the game. So even if you play it in a homeostatic way, you want the system to stay stable, then there is an extra level of decision that you have to take into account to make that happen, which to me makes the game more interesting. That if you do not have that element, if that element is simply hardwired in the design, and so you do not have to worry about the climate. But then I also see how other groups may take this in a completely different way and using the climate element much more aggressively. Then I'm gonna get my animals big and furry, and I want the climate to get very cold, while my opponents is having these small svelte animals and can't wait until the weather becomes very hot and my giant mammoths start dying out. So I can totally see how that can work differently in different groups, and I like that flexibility. I like the flexibility that the climate expansion adds something, or a lot, but what it adds will change in different groups. Each group can choose to do whatever they want with the climate. Work together to keep it stable or try to exploit it in the most cutthroat way possible by setting up certain animals and try to pull the climate in that direction. Speaking of that, of course, sometimes even if you look at things mimetically from the natural point of view, sometimes things will look a little funny. For example, a herbivore may develop defensive herding before the opponents develop pack hunting, which seems strange. How do they know that these other guys would do that? But then the answer that we gave ourselves when we saw this, it seemed a little strange, was that after all, the species that we were controlling the game weren't necessarily all the ones that were in the environment. So we imagine that if you are playing some defensive trait that doesn't immediately address something that the other players have done, if you play a defensive trait that is not a reaction to something that is on the table, we can imagine there's a reaction to something that animals not in the game, non-playing species, have done. So even from that point of view, we had that moment of hesitation about the theme, but then the elements of the theme fell into place. So the theme is fun, the thing is enjoyable, the game, I believe, has an educational value, but even if that wasn't the case, the theme is tight. And again, to me, a game is strong if the theme is tight, even if it's not intrinsically realistic. But the elements of the theme go well together, and the mechanics go well together. They present me with very interesting challenges, with a nice back and forth, with a nice organic feel that everything that happens I have to take into account. At the same time, it's not that there are ideally too many animals. Maybe if you're playing with the maximum number of players, then it can get a little confusing and you have to be a little more like go with the flow. But if you're playing with 2-3 players, then you get a good sense of what everybody has. The game becomes more strategic. You have a better sense of control. And again, you can get a good sense and develop a strategy without having to cause a painful, excruciating analysis paralysis. So mechanically it works well. I like the interaction. I like, again, this dynamic feel. It's very interactive. Again, even if I never eat any of your animals, it's going to be incredibly interactive because I had to plan main strategy entirely around what you were doing. To defend against what you could possibly do, to try to go around the defenses that you have already put in place and look what I have, and then decide to go another direction, to give up, but going in that herbivore direction is simply because I've given up being a carnivore based on what you've done. So there's incredible total constant interaction. It may not necessarily result in animals eating each other. The possibility that is there is simply one of the driving elements of the design, on top of course of being efficient eaters of resources and being able to synergize your changes with the changes in the environment. Overall, a very organic, a very tight game. The art is excellent, gameplay is very strong, the theme I like, and again, it seems reliable, it seems realistic to me, which gives an extra educational value. In general, I really like Evolution Climate. I suggest if you don't have any games in the Evolution system, just go with this one because I don't think you can go wrong. If you really want to be safe, you can try the normal Evolution and then you buy the Climate board later. But again, I like the fact that if you buy Evolution Climate, then you have both possibilities, both ways of playing the game. And for example, if you're playing with younger gamers, 6, 7, maybe 6 is a little too young, but 7, 8-year-old, then you can play the standard game without the Climate, then you have the Climate board, and then you can ease younger or very casual gamers into the design gradually. And I believe that that will facilitate, make it easier for people to get into the game, because definitely it is a good game and one that is worth getting into. Evolution Climate, really strong, very good design.